My father was 19 years old when he sat in a rabbi's office for the first time. "I want to be Jewish," my father told the rabbi. The rabbi stared intently at the young couple before him. He quizzed my mother on some prayers, and he listened to their love story. And in his living room, surrounded by a whole wall of books, the rabbi gently replied, "No, what you want to do is almost impossible." And as he walked my parents to the door, he handed my father a small blue skull cap, saying, "Take this kippah, go live as a Jew, and then we'll see." My dad didn't understand. Why was he being turned away? So my mother explained to him that this was the Jewish way. To reject or turn away the interested convert 3 times is a test of perseverance and conviction of purpose. We're so against proselytizing that we err on the side of deterrence to ensure that anyone joining our ranks is serious. Eventually, my father makes it through the preliminary criteria. He sits for a Beit Din, enters the mikveh, and even undergoes a ritual circumcision as an adult, just so he can be accepted fully as a member of the Jewish people. I share that very intimate detail with you with his permission. And also because I can't imagine a single one of us just heard that part of the story. It didn't just cringe a little bit, whether it's just from the TMI of it or also just from the sheer brutality of it. 48 years later, my father has lived nearly half a century as a practicing Jew. He speaks Hebrew and Yiddish fluently, he makes an incredible matzo ball soup, and he can chant Jewish liturgy with the ease of someone who was born into the faith. Yet he says that even though his Judaism is as true for him as his citizenship, his birth language, his gender, or any of the other framing identity markers, he feels that the Jewish world will always see him as a convert, never as just a Jew. Look what we do to our people, our fellow Jews. We're so small, and the litmus test to be accepted is so heavy, not just in the first conversation we have around conversion, but in every aspect of Jewish communal life. We start by asking, are you serious about your faith? Our anxiety fluttering around this notion that Judaism might just be a phase for some people, opposed to a long-lasting existential reshaping of your soul. But for those of us born as Jews, we don't ask the same question. We assume that there's no choice involved, that because of your blood, you're stuck with this Jewish family, whereas the convert can leave at any time. But Judaism is Hotel California for all of us, and pretending like there isn't a choice is reductive and insulting to both the convert and the Jew by birth, because there's always a choice. To stay, to leave, to grow, to change, to invest in a new future. The one thing that Judaism never promises is certainty. Certainty is for the fundamentalists to worry about. We know that nothing is for sure, and that when we encounter something that feels unknowable, our first reaction needs to be curiosity rather than a definitive solution. In rabbinical school, I was taught the adage, never remind a convert that they are a convert, the way you never remind an adopted child they are adopted. This specifically was linked to how harmful outing a convert could be. And I do agree, of course, that outing someone against their will is a harmful process. However, pretending that we all enter this community in the same way and have the same perceptions, practices, and historical contexts makes for a superficial uniformity. We pay a price for selling the idea that success looks like passing for a Jew by birth. The story of how you entered Jewish community, just like the story of your biological heritage relating to your adoptive family, matters a great deal. None of us are Jews in the same way, nor do we all have the same emotional ties to tradition or even believe the same things. We can't start with rejection, nor can we continue our microaggressions internally. This is one of the ways we stay a small people. Don't shout the beauty of your faith from the rooftops. Don't join a faith because your heart is being called to it. Be practical. Use your head and prove to us that you mean what you say. But that can't be how we continue. After all, as much as Jews prize the intellect, Judaism is still first and foremost a religion. And religion isn't fact, it's faith. And faith, as I choose to define it, is the belief that the world can be different from its current reality. Faith is hope in the face of the impossible. when an adult grasps Torah for the first time, when a woman who never felt like she belonged is overcome with the truth that here she has found a place of faith who loves her for who she is without equivocation. When we laugh at either the faith of delight or the face of disgust at the first taste of gefilte fish, these are the ways we awaken our tradition. Our faith is enlivened, challenged, and shaped by a variety of experiences, beliefs, and practices. Not just by our blood or by our individual stories of origin. Our current versions of faith and conversion are limiting, and this thing we're doing, this faith community, is so much bigger than any of that. We are building a beloved community that requires us to see others who want to join us and say, yes, I will take you. Thank you for wanting to be here. Practicing the very Jewish and radical act of love. Howard Thurman was an educator, theologian, and civil rights leader. In the Jewish world, he was affectionately known as the Black Rebbe by Rabbi Dr. Shalomi and Martin Buber. Thurman believed that there was no way to understand Christian theology without understanding the community from which Jesus emerged, addressing the complexity of Jewish identity in temple times. Back then, it would have been easy for Jewish people to be swallowed up by the popular Hellenism of the times. The Jews had to find a way to maintain their unique identity. Thurman teaches that there were 3 ways of interacting with secular culture as an act of self-preservation: assimilation, isolationism, revolt. Assimilation was the path of the Sadducees. They were the upper class, the high priests who operated the monopoly of contemporary worship. The Sadducees assimilated as best they could to the social behavior pattern of the dominant group. However, we reduce the external signs of difference so outwardly appear like everyone else, we give up a great deal. There's no such thing as assimilation without some loss of self. Isolationism, on the other hand, was the path of the Pharisees, who operated in direct conflict with the Sadducees. The Pharisees had terrible contempt for the mainstream and for those who didn't oppose it. Their resistance to assimilation laid the groundwork for the emergent rabbinic Judaism. They preferred cultural isolation in the face of rejected culture and created their own brand of Jewish practice. Thurman's 3rd way was to revolt, which was the path of the Zealots, who believed that neither assimilating nor isolation was the way to engage with the dominant culture. This often looked like armed resistance, whose success was measured by how hard it would be for the enemy to crush them. The Jewish struggle to maintain our unique identity while living with an oppositional dominant culture has been and continues to be a question of Jewish survival. It's been 2,000 years and we're still practicing these same 3 ways of coping. We are constantly challenged in big and small ways to decide whether to uphold or deny our own uniqueness, pretending our otherness doesn't exist. It's not just the secular world that forces these 3 approaches. We do it within the Jewish community too. The ultra-Orthodox and the progressive reform movement deny one another all the time. Oh, you don't accept women equally. Well, you don't observe mitzvot properly. You're an extremist. Well, you're not really a rabbi. We decide that the things that the other sects of Judaism are doing are incorrect, and therefore we must separate and reject them. And only when we feel collectively threatened, only when a synagogue is shut up, only when Israel's on fire, do we put our differences aside and come together. Worse, we do it even within the Jewish community we belong to. We judge the convert. We question who's really fasting. We wonder if you're truly invested in this community because you don't show up enough, give enough, speak up enough. Enough of all these tests of inclusion along arbitrary barriers which force us to continue in these cycles of reaction. There are times for all 3 of these approaches, but any singular one of those, assimilation, isolation, revolt, cannot be the primary guide for living. In an individual setting, to consistently deny yourself in order to fit in, or to consistently separate yourself and be disengaged from the world, or to consistently fight for your right to survive in the world, all of those in a long-term way will deteriorate the soul. There must be a 4th way, one that isn't about how the outside world forces us to defend ourselves or deny ourselves, but rather allows for us to define ourselves. For the individual, defining ourselves, rather than being defined by the structure we're living in, is another way of acknowledging the divine light within. Self-definition, rather than a reactive expression, allows for power to emerge in situations, relationships, and environments where we might have felt stagnant and incapable of changing course. For this reason, the triad reactionary system that has been part of our cultural practice for centuries must be investigated on a personal level too. We must self-define who we are in our bodies, who we are in our marriages, or in our relationships with our children or our parents, and who we are in relationship to our Judaism. Self-definition is critical because the price of staying in a reactive space is just too painful. In a communal setting, we fall into traps where we want to define something else in an effort of showing love. Where we might say to someone else, I know you want to fit in, so this is how you pray, or this is how you cook, or this is how you rest on Shabbat. And it is important for belonging. You don't want to feel weird or separate from a group that you love. But we don't get to define Judaism or what it means to be a Jew for anyone else. If we truly believe that Jewish souls are Jewish souls no matter how long it takes for them to find their way, then we can't defend the current standard practices as the solitary definition of Jewish identity. If we want the Jewish world to continue, and we believe that there is something unique that we have to offer the world, then we need to define that piece very specifically, accepting the way people come to us and how they integrate into our community. What makes a Jew isn't dogma or theology or culture or race or blood or Zionism, it's the tribe. In the last 18 months, grappling with a global pandemic has taught us new ways to relate and congregate. We have learned ways to diversify, be flexible, and include, and how, when the bottom drops and nothing is the same anymore, how important it is to feel like we belong. The world rejects us over and over and over again. What would it mean to proactively reach out to the people in our lives saying, have you thought about Judaism? By which we might mean many things. It could mean traditional conversion with the introduction to Judaism class, the Beit Din and mikveh. It could also mean none of those traditional paths to Jewish life, but rather saying, I'm a part of a community that accepts me for who I am and wants the unique gifts that I bring to this community. Howard Thurman teaches that a lack of fellowship, the lack of ability to engage in warmth and genuineness, is the singular contributing factor to germinating hatred. The countermeasure to hate is the fourth way, which Thurman and MLK and Cornel West and Martin Buber called beloved community. It's not to assimilate, denying who we are so we can fit in. It's not to separate, to force ourselves into our own little space so we can continue believing all the same things. It's not to revolt and have violence and reject others. The fourth way is to be as present as possible, to open our arms as wide as imaginable with the same openness in heart and mind, letting each moment define itself for what it is. What a radical way to live in the world, to love and be loved for exactly who we are. What could be holier than that? When Julie first stepped into Temple Sholom, she was so nervous her hands couldn't stop shaking. All her life, religion has been about sin, about triumph over evil, about questions that had no answers. She'd known for a long time that her soul was Jewish. That was clear. What she didn't know was whether a community of Jews would see her the same way. She sat and she waited for the Saturday morning minyan to arrive, community members rolling in on JST, Jewish Standard Time, which was approximately 15 minutes late, something Julie would never get used to. They greeted her, sat next to her, sang with her. And as that first service concluded, Julie knew something she had never known before. She was home. These were her people, a family that had been waiting just for her. Of course, this is simplified. There was plenty to study, trials to endure, and anti-Semitism to shockingly confront for the first time from a personal point of view. But all that happened here at Temple Sholom is that Julie walked in firm in the truth of her Jewish soul. And we never told her otherwise, because she was right. It's so seductive to believe in the mythology that what we do and what we don't do are the only definitions of who we are. It's a way that superficially allows us to draw lines about who's in and who's out. Is it possible to reimagine what Jewish communal life could look like, where the boundaries of belonging are unattached to the individual integration of Jewish culture or personal perseverance, but rather focused on augmenting our personal impact in the world through converging our collective gifts to alleviate suffering? Can we breathe into life a new set of norms that will help us uphold an inclusive mentality of universalism and particularism in order to become the beloved community which we seek to become? All of us need a sense of belonging to remind us that we're not alone, we're not crazy, and we're mortal. And if there's anything we should be doing as a community of Jews, it should be fostering a sense of belonging and meaning so that individuals, our community, our city, and our world might be improved. If we want Judaism to continue, it can't just be because we're a tribe, or just because we've always done it this way, or because definitions of Jewish identity are seen as stagnant. None of those are accurate. Our survival must be defined, standing on its own rather than as an act of denial, defense, or destruction. It has to be because our unique gift to the world is to help others make it a better place, to realize heaven on earth in tangible ways. So I asked my dad, what at this point in your Jewish journey remains difficult? And he said, the hardest part of being a convert to Judaism is having to fight against those who question you, even those you love the most, proving yourself that Jewish life is a calling and not a choice. Aren't you tired of trying to prove your worth, your sincerity? I am, and I didn't even convert. All of us struggle with our otherness, trying to prove our sincerity for the choices we make in our lives. It is seductive to follow the victorious, to believe that we have a monopoly on truth and practice. But the fourth way has little to do with force or stagnant beliefs. It is the embodiment of loving the stranger, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because we are strangers, someplace in the world, and we get it. We know what home feels like and what a blessing it is to come home. Earlier this year, one of our elderly congregants died. I'd been in his hospice room back and forth all day, worried that he'd be alone when the time came, since his family lived really far away. And over the hours of his deterioration, the hospice nurse and I had a chance to get to know each other. I heard about her religious background, what brought her into the hospice field, and her approach to care. When the time came, I held the old man in my arms, and I sang Shema to him. And his last breath ended with the last word, Echad. The room was so still, his presence and the holiness of the moment frozen. And the hospice nurse said, I told you I was a Christian, but what I didn't tell you was that I was born a Jew. And until I heard the Shema just now, I'd forgotten what it meant to me. It doesn't go away, this Jewish feeling, this Jewish way of being in the world. Not for the hospice nurse or the old man, not for Julie, not for my father, not for any of us. There's no test to prove how Jewish you are. It just is. And the way we can trust in that truth is by leaving some of our baggage around boundaries and self-imposed definitions of faith at the door. These gates are closing, and a new season of belonging is unfolding before us, telling us that this Jewish faith was never about a tribe surviving. It was always about belonging. We rise together now on page 114 for Avinu Malkeinu, calling out to God with a hope for change.